Kia ora koutou, ko Sean Thompson toku ingoa, ko Tamahanga toku maunga, ko Mahurangi toku awa. I ngā mana, i ngā reo, e rau rangatira mā tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Well, it's my pleasure to be joining you remotely today from Wellington. As I said, my name is Sean Thompson. I'm the Advanced Care Planning Manager for the Greater Wellington region. So Wellington, Hutt Valley, Wairarapa and Porirua Kapiti Coast. I'm here today to just give you a very brief presentation, a brief talk about some research that I undertook a few years ago. Now, my background is as a paramedic, and I've worked as a paramedic based mostly out of Wellington for the past maybe 20 to 25 years. And as part of my master's research, I looked at witness experiences of paramedic care during unsuccessful resuscitation attempts in Aotearoa New Zealand. And that was for a Master's of Professional Practice thesis at Aotearoa Polytech. It was a fascinating experience, one of the best experiences of my life. I loved doing the research, and mostly what I loved actually was just hearing stories and hearing real stories, because I spoke to people who had witnessed someone very dear to them, someone close to them, collapse. The paramedics came, attempted to resuscitate their loved one, but their loved one ultimately died. And I heard their stories, I heard their experiences of what it was like to be cared for by a clinician, by a paramedic in this case, during an incredibly traumatic time, just an absolute whirlwind of emotions. And I heard their stories, and I also got an insight into the lives and the stories of this dear person who had died. So just briefly, I would like to go over some keys that I learned from this qualitative piece of research into how we as clinicians, from whatever area we work, how we can impact on those who are also perhaps experiencing a terrible trauma, such as a cardiac arrest, or whatever it might be. I was really keen to understand what the impact was on those who witnessed a traumatic event. What do they remember? What impact or influence do clinicians have on the witnesses at that time of the event, and also in the future? What do they look back on? So I loved collecting the stories and the data and the experiences of these people. So as I go along, I'll repeat to you some of the words that some of the people said. One of the gentlemen I spoke to, his name was Stu. He was a 58-year-old male, and I used pseudonyms for this research. But Stu was a 58-year-old male, and he witnessed the death of his mother. And he said, I should have been able to make sense of it, but I couldn't. It was just like, that's my mum, and they're doing CPR on her in the bedroom. I also spoke to a young woman named Jess, who's 30 years of age. She was at work in a cafe one day, and her boss collapsed, had a cardiac arrest, and ultimately died. And she said, you remember how bloody scary it is when something like that happens? You actually feel quite helpless. You just want that person to wake up, but they're not going to. And I heard many, many more stories besides these, but I came out with 6 major themes, and I'd like to just go through those 6 themes just briefly with you. The first one was around just what it's like to witness a death, or for any of you, what it's like to witness any significantly traumatic event that doesn't necessarily have to end up in a death. But the thing that really came home to me was just the intense multitude of emotions that people experience. Shock, guilt, powerlessness, bewilderment, these all-consuming emotions. Some even had physical emotional reactions where they just physically collapsed. Fear, helplessness, dread came up a lot. Dreadful was used a lot. Some even actually really contained their emotions, and they held them in because that's what they knew they needed to do. Some had absent emotions. They felt devoid of all emotion at that time. Some felt this incredible weight of responsibility. Others, within all of this, actually felt hope, even acceptance at a very early stage. So these multiple emotions just were there within a very, very short time space. And the paramedics in this case, but for all of you, whatever role you're in, whether you're in a clinical role or a support role, or maybe you're a firefighter or a police officer, whatever you might be doing, You are there as this person in a professional role perhaps, while these other people are going through this incredible cyclone of emotional experiences. The second theme that I identified was around witness welfare, around how we actually care for the witnesses and what their welfare needs are. And the first thing that really came through strongly was just the relief that they described when the experts came along. Just the value of having someone arrive who knew what they were doing, that they could have some sense of, stability, like an anchor to hold on to with this professional person there. Now it became really clear that it was vital that the witnesses were supported, that they had support, and whether that was a support of the clinical team, or maybe it was the support of loved ones, family members, friends, neighbours who we as paramedics in this scenario could have called on to come and help them and be with them there. They also relied on the clinical team to be their guides. You know, we, from whatever clinical background you're in, we've been through this before. We've seen trauma. We've seen really tough, awful, hard experiences through our careers. For a lot of people in the community or in the hospital setting or wherever it might be, they may never have seen that before. This might be their first time experiencing this, and they need us as a guide to shepherd them through this process. They need our strength. Witnesses often have dual roles, so sometimes they might be witness to the event where their loved one has had this traumatic event, but they also may be having a dual role as being caregivers. So remember that while they're witnessing this, they might be caring for somebody else. So maybe they've got another family they need to care for. Maybe they have a son or a daughter or a child or someone else they're thinking of who is impacted by this event. It's also really important to be the conduit and offer connection with other family supports, and potentially even spiritual or cultural supports. The third theme that I identified was care for the deceased. It was incredibly important that we, as paramedics, realised that that person who had died was still this person's loved one. It's really interesting, there's some really interesting research that shows that the significance of a recently deceased person is at its greatest just after death. So and research also seems to indicate that the significance of that person's life is more important, more real and more present than at any other time in that person's life, even more important and more real and more present than when they were born, because they've got this whole span of life and existence that has come to an end, and just at the point when the loved ones are fighting this need or this obligation to also let them go, their significance and their mana and their esteem is at its highest point at that moment of death and soon after death. So it's so important that we reconnect people with their loved ones. If their loved one has died, or if their loved one has been through a significant medical event or an operation, that they are allowed to reconnect, that they cannot be separated, they need to be reconnected. Also, if you are caring for a body, look after them with the utmost care. Give them the respect, the honour, the mana that they deserve, and whatever that might mean. The fourth theme I identified was around demeanour. This was an interesting one, and this often came down to this sense of maturity or experience of the clinician. You know, how experienced they were, how reliable they were and trustworthy they were. Were they a good, safe pair of hands? What came through really commonly was, which surprised me, was how grateful people were to see the clinicians expressing emotion. I've often felt that in my professional career that I need to hold my emotions in. I need to keep them to myself because they don't need to come into someone else's emotional experience. But actually, when we as clinicians, as professionals, are open with our emotions, you know, maybe not a blubbering heap on the floor, but just, you know, able to shed a tear, able to show genuine empathy, that has a huge impact on people. Stu said, one of my participants, Stu said, you know, they were genuinely sad about what had happened. Another woman, Liz, she said, I remember his lovely tone of voice. She remembered the tone of voice of the paramedic who was caring for the person who he was trying to resuscitate. Stu also said, to be emotionally and physically supported with my hand held was beyond, I can't describe how much of a difference that made. He actually choked up when he made that comment. He had a paramedic who held his hand the whole time while his mother was being resuscitated, and while she ultimately died. The fifth theme is after the clinicians have gone. So after we go, what happens? There are shockwaves that continue long after we go that we will never understand, will never be aware of, but it was incredibly helpful for me to see that life does go on, but at the same time that this event has a significant impact on people. And we must always be cognizant of how our approach, how our care may or may not impact on that. Stu said, I know of people who have had bad care, and he said that the grieving has gone on and on and on. And finally, the sixth thing for me was communication, and that came through really, really clearly in this research. And what I found was that communication needs to be clear and it needs to be simple. You don't need to give a traumatized, grieving, scared person lots of information. You need to show empathy, you need to demonstrate, empathetic, warm body language, but clear, simple words. They won't remember so much what you say, but they will remember how you say it. And that came through very, very clearly to me. So taking time, showing empathy, treating others as you would like to be treated. Actually, you know what? Not treating them as you would like to be treated, treating them as they would like to be treated. What's important to you? How can I help you in this time of your need? Stu said, everything was explained to me as if I was a novice. And at that stage, my head was addled. I was a novice. He said, this is an event that drains people of their normal capabilities and even their rational thinking. And when you give some people information in a shocking situation, they actually retain none of it. So that is in a nutshell my research. I'd be very happy to talk more about it. I'd be very happy to be contacted about this. So please go and see your facilitators of this workshop, and they've got my contact details. I'm more than happy to speak more at length about this research and share the thesis with you. But it's my pleasure, and I wish you all the very best as you go out there and care for people and share your aroha, your love and your empathy with the people who you're guiding through these significant life events. Ka kite.